Hello, my name is Carol Schultz Vento. This presentation is about my father and my relationship with my father in terms of post-World War II. My father was an 82nd Airborne paratrooper who jumped into Normandy on D-Day. My father's exploits have been memorialized in books and also in films. The most prominent of the films is The Longest Day. This is the edition that came out in June of 1959 in Reader's Digest. It was a condensed version of The Longest Day. My father is mentioned significantly in the book. He was 82nd Airborne paratrooper, and the scenes in the book and in the movie that discuss his pre-D-Day and his D-Day jump are scenes that I remember seeing when I went to the premiere of The Longest Day with my father in Philadelphia. There were a number of premieres around the country at that point. The one I went to, I was about 15, and I went to the premiere with my father. There were a number of dignitaries, generals there, some of the stars of the movie. I remember specifically Paul Anka at that point. And I saw the movie, and I remember thinking to myself, my father's war wasn't so bad. It's black and white. There's no blood, and he's mainly lost. The scenes that people might remember from the book and the movie have to do, first of all, with my father being, I guess, in a large hangar before the D-Day jump where they were playing craps, and my father won $2,500 in a crap game. However, he sort of had a fatalistic feeling that if he kept the $2,500, something bad would happen to him. And he got this feeling after he got these rosaries in a letter from my grandmother. My father also, just because he was a good Catholic boy, in the book it said that he lost the money because of that fatalistic feeling, which was partially true. However, he also wanted to beat a sergeant who was winning. So he went back into the game and tried to beat the sergeant. He lost all the money that he had won. The next scene in the movie that I remember is my father being stuck upside down in a tree after the jump. He cut himself out. I remember a few other scenes, but I think the one that's stuck with me the most is the final scene in the movie where Richard Beymer, who's the actor who's portraying my father, is sitting with Richard Burton, who played a RAF pilot who was shot down. And Richard Burton says something to Richard Beymer, something like, "I'm crippled. He's dead," speaking about a German who was lying dead, "and you're lost." So my whole image of Dad's war was, as I said before, that he was mainly lost and there wasn't any bloodshed. I had this image in my mind for quite a while. However, I never understood Dad's trauma. My parents divorced when I was 12, and Dad dealt with post-war trauma, post-war alcoholism, a few more marriages, and I never quite understood that a lot of this was caused, sort of the destruction of our family was caused by his war trauma, his World War II war trauma. So about 2003 or so, I talked to my dad. Another book was coming out about my dad. He had been in a number of books. The two that I remember the most were one by Patrick O'Donnell called Beyond Valor, and another one in about 2003, 2004 by Ed Ruggiero, which was called First Men In. And I basically began to read about my dad's real D-Day and real war. At that point, I started to question Dad about actually what his war was like. After he died in 2005, I was able to get some of the archives from the files of both Cornelius Ryan, who wrote The Longest Day, and Stephen Ambrose, who had included my father in a number of his World War II books. And I was able really to see what my dad had been saying, that he had really not said to me all those years, because he kept it inside. Part of my dad's words I've included in my book, which is called The Hidden Legacy of World War II. Dad said the first night, he was lost, as the movie showed, but he was eventually found by one of his lieutenants, who then got wounded, and then he was found by General Gavin. The night of D-Day, General Gavin took them to the railroad tracks along Lafayette Bridge, which was where very, very heavy fighting was occurring to keep the Germans from closing off that bridge or capturing the bridge where soldiers were coming up from Utah Beach. Dad said, I heard this horrendous screaming and screaming and screaming. It seemed like it lasted eternally. I don't know who it was who was hit. I know that I was alone by then, even though I had a foxhole next to somebody, but I didn't know him. I'm not sure I got any sleep that night. The battle for Lafayette went on for a few days, and Dad was involved in it. So that was my first inkling that Dad's war was not bloodless. And he told me when I was talking to him, after I decided to write this book, he told me that he had never been so scared in his life as when he jumped into Normandy. Dad also told me to write the book from my point of view. He said that he had been written about in a number of books, and his story had been told, but he wanted me to write it as a daughter of a traumatized war veteran. So that's what I did. Dad's next battle was Market Garden, where he lost his beloved company commander, Anthony Stefanich. It was not only the devastating loss for us, but the regiment as well. He was a born leader who led by example, not by virtue of rank. To the men of C Company, he was our leader and friend. I felt like I lost an older brother. He was what I would have wanted to be when I finally grew up. It was the only time in combat that I broke down and wept over someone that I cared about. A close friend of mine, Walter Farentoff, was killed a week later. While I mourned his loss, there were no tears. So this started, I guess, Dad bottling up his feelings in terms of the losses that he was dealing with during the war. The bulge, he was taken offline, I guess, around Christmas Day during the bulge because he had double pneumonia and I think dysentery. When he came back in early January, he said, I reported for duty to a company that was virtually wiped out. The officers were all gone and we had about 30 men left. If I could have cried, I might have gotten some of the pain and guilt out. I lost some good friends who taught me how to survive in combat, inspired me with their courage and sacrifice. The C Company I come to know and love no longer existed. So basically, those were the experiences that basically formed him during the war. He never broke down during the war. He lasted until they got to Germany. When they got to Germany, the 82nd assisted in liberating a camp called Voblin, which was basically a smaller camp where they were moving some of the inhabitants, some of the poor people who were in the larger camps, to the smaller camp as the Allies were getting closer and closer to defeating the Germans. Dad had never talked to me about it until I asked him a specific question. I started asking him a lot of specific questions at that point. I said, "Dad, were you ever near a concentration camp?" He said, "Oh, yes, we liberated one." This was about, I guess, 2 years before he died. And I said, "Were you in it?" And he said, "Oh, I was close by." Well, he was actually in it. And then he said, I remember the odor. I remember the smell. I think I'll never forget that." But he never gave me any more information about it. And he also wrote about it, I think it was just Stephen Ambrose. "Living skeletons were scattered about. It was difficult to distinguish the living from the dead. We forced the German population from the various towns around the camp to dig graves and bury over 200 bodies in front of a castle, Ludwigs List. If we ever needed a reason for fighting a war, this was it." So I think it impacted him so much that he really couldn't even talk about it during those years. What got me interested in delving a lot more into the research for my book, I didn't want my book just to be a personal story. I have an academic and a legal background, so I wanted to have a format where I was actually using information and historical records to document what my dad was going through. I not only had his archival material from the various authors, I also had all of his VA files, which I was able to get after he died. And it turned out that he had been trying to get assistance for PTSD, which was not a diagnosis then, for war trauma from 1946 on. He was denied for years. He was given diagnosis like psychoneurosis, failure to digest wartime experiences, anxiety neurosis, chronic alcoholism. But it wasn't until basically, I would say, the 1990s that he was finally given benefits for his war neurosis, for his PTSD. It wasn't until after the Vietnam veterans basically came back having post-war trauma that a diagnosis in 1980 of PTSD became official in the DSM. Finally, I think he was 80 when he got that diagnosis, and he got some back benefits. He also had been diagnosed with a bad back because in his Normandy jump, the plane was trying to evade the enemy fire and ended up dropping the paratroopers extremely low. So he had a bad back from that. He ended up getting some benefits for that before he ended up getting any benefits for the psychiatric turmoil that he went through. The impact on my family was that my parents divorced, as I said. I had a younger sister. My younger sister ended up dying at age 22, partly because I think of the upheaval and dysfunction in our household, which occurred. The two of us were never really sure what was going to happen, and we didn't understand what was happening with our father. He basically hit bottom with his alcoholism when I was about 16, 17. And he was sent out to California by one of his best friends who was a paratrooper buddy, to his parents. And his parents, my grandmother had been an Army nurse in World War I. My grandfather was a World War I Marine who had suffered from shell shock. He had been gassed, and he was one of the few survivors of Belleau Wood battle. So it wasn't until he was sent out there. My dad was close to suicidal at that point. However, he basically had hit bottom. He started going to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings every night, and he also, the rest of his life, was a recovering alcoholic. He never had another drink. He went to college. He got a bachelor's degree from California Western in '67, came back to Philadelphia, and then ended up getting a master's in psychology and worked in addiction programs. He became the director of addiction program in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And he then went back to California, married for the third time, went back to California, ended up working in a number of addiction programs, being the director, and his final job was at Fort Irwin in California, heading up the alcohol and drug abuse unit to help young soldiers. So basically he came full circle. So that's my personal story. I wanted to sort of go through why there's been the myth of the greatest generation coming back unscathed. They're held up as being different from warriors of later wars. Nothing could be further from the truth. If you look at the documentation and the evidence, a lot of soldiers were not only dealing from post-war trauma, they were dealing with trauma during the war. It was thought at the beginning of World War II that you wouldn't have as many shell-shocked soldiers as you did in World War I because they were careful in trying to weed out those who were considered mentally weak. However, it ended up that so many were be taken offline in terms of the battle that they were taken back to rest for a week and sent back into combat. In the beginning, it was thought that just getting them right back into combat was the most efficient and proper way, and basically it was like, just get back onto the horse. However, that really didn't work. There was also a diagnosis made of Guadalcanal neurosis, where at a naval hospital, one of the psychiatrists talked about the Marines coming back from Guadalcanal with all these symptoms of tremors, night terrors, shaking, panic attacks. After the war, the kind of treatment that soldiers got, a lot of soldiers decided not to really emphasize their post-traumatic stress too much. My dad tried, but he didn't, he was still functional. The soldiers who ended up being hospitalized, there were 39 Veterans Administration psychiatric hospitals during that time. And the treatments were really somewhat primitive. Electric and insulin shock therapy were some of the treatments to try to shock the soldiers out of their wartime trauma. And over 2,000 veterans in the psychiatric hospitals were lobotomized, which was considered in the late 40s, early 50s as a remedy for mental illness, which was what the post-traumatic stress was considered back then. Less than 10% of them ever were able to leave the institutions that they were in. Part of the problem, too, is that censorship during World War II was a lot different than my generation saw with the Vietnam War. They basically tried to control images. Images of dead soldiers weren't shown until 1943, and they basically were images that were sort of peaceful and serene of a soldier just lying there dead. So people had the impression that, okay, they died, but it was sort of a peaceful death, which was as far from the truth as it could be. In addition, the policy of replacing soldiers in combat units, not as a whole unit, but as individuals. So if you had casualties and deaths in a combat unit, you would get replacements coming in from what they called the Repel-Depel. My dad came in as a replacement in Normandy for those in his 505 PIR regiment who were killed in Sicily and in Italy. So they weren't always totally accepted because the old timers were sort of afraid that maybe they wouldn't get to know them well. And also they replaced some of the buddies who were killed or wounded. From my research, I further found that there were not as many soldiers in combat in World War II as I had originally expected. It said maybe, the research showed that maybe about 25% of the 16 million who served in World War II were in combat zones, and probably 15% were in extended combat. So a lot who came back were well adjusted because they hadn't been exposed to a lot of combat. Those of us who had fathers who were in combat, we basically felt that we were alone, that we didn't understand what was going on until we got a lot older. Something that opened my eyes to the reality of combat was Saving Private Ryan. And my father is part of a documentary that was attached to some of the early DVDs of Saving Private Ryan. It was done by a director and writer named Chris Hardy, and she wrote one of the forewords for my book, for which I am very grateful. But Dad talked about his D-Day and his fear, and I was really glad that toward the end of his life, I really totally understood. Well, not totally. I understood as best as I could the trauma he went through, the help that he didn't get, and the difficulty that it caused our family. It broke up our family. It also broke up a lot of other families, the whole idea of post-war trauma, because I was beginning to get other stories from children of World War II combat veterans who told me that similar things happened to them, and that individually we all thought we were the only ones who were dealing with this type of trauma in our fathers. The greatest generation was definitely the greatest generation. However, we have to acknowledge what they dealt with, how much terror and fear they went through, and the scars of war that occur in every generation. John Kennedy, in a commencement speech at Yale on June 11th, 1962, said, "For the great enemy of truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Too often we hold fast to the cliches of our forebears. We subject all facts to a prefabricated set of interpretations. We enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought." So what I tried to do in my book was, as I said before, to use documentation, use VA files, use old journal articles, any type of documentation that I could find in my research to sort of support the argument that the World War II veteran faded and celebrated, also suffered quite a bit. And my dad understood that. My dad also felt somewhat, I would say, sheepish about being highlighted in The Longest Day. a letter to Cornelius Ryan after The Longest Day came out in that condensed version in 1959. On the one hand, I felt proud of myself, and on the other, I felt some uneasiness because I know that I certainly did nothing that wasn't done better by many other fellows, which I think is the prevailing attitude of that generation, that they didn't do anything special. They weren't heroes, and the real heroes were those who were left behind. I'll be glad to take any questions, and thank you for listening to my presentation.